more than ever now, where we need to be conscious of how we act towards one another, both in real life and on Twitter, and turn off your burner accounts. And so one of the things that I think is really important, though, is to talk about this idea of inclusion and kind of move past the diversity discussion and really sort of try and figure out what do we mean when we talk about inclusion. And we've been really honored to have an incredible panel here. We have Ann and Naya from 3M, we have Sophia Khan from Medtronic, and then we have Janie Finn, our moderator from Finesse Partners. And I think this is probably the most important discussion of the day, because when you come out of here, you're going to really understand what we mean when we talk about inclusion, and then hopefully we'll have some prescriptive measures here about how we build companies from the start with this inclusive ideal, because there's so many different genders and races and people represented in today's world, and we want to create a world that, companies and a business world that imbues and enriches that. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what these folks have to say. So Janie, I'm going to turn it over to you and take it away.
Thank you. So as I was preparing for this discussion, the more and more I learned, I realized how huge this topic is, and it's a topic that's been around forever. And I tried to figure out how we're going to discuss all the issues that have to do with diversity and inclusion, realized that was never going to happen. So trying to put this in a more broad perspective, trying to just cover what it is we are really talking about when we talk about diversity and inclusion, why we're discussing this now, what is different, what has changed, trying to look at it through the eyes of kind of the socioeconomic, the political, and even generational levels. As Ann mentioned, she calls it how we go from an unconscious bias to awareness and action. And please take really what you're learning today and think about some questions that really are near and dear to you for your life, for your work, for your family, for your community. And feel free to ask questions at the end. We will have quite a bit of time for questions and answers. So I'm going to begin by asking Ann and Sophia their stories and how they came to lead at a very executive levels the diversity and inclusion areas of both Medtronic and 3M. Keep in mind that Sophia started out life as an economist and Ann started out life as an attorney, so they have their own very diverse views on this topic. So Sophia, if you'd like to start.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for choosing our section. We're very honored. Again, as you said, this topic is really broad. We can go in a million different directions, and we're open to doing that, yeah? So ask what you want. For me, look, diversity and inclusion there was no career path. I didn't choose it. I think it chose me. Some for obvious reasons, because I am diverse, so I checked the box, okay? So I'm female, I'm over the age of 40 now, I'm a single mom, let's see what else, I'm an immigrant. What else can we check? Gosh, I'm Muslim, ooh. So there's lots of things I can check, but outside of those obvious or maybe not so obvious pieces is the family I was raised in. So as an immigrant, I was born in London. My parents are from India and from Pakistan. And so education being really super important. But also my dad's perspective, what I heard growing up, we grew up with really differing kind of political systems, social systems where we just didn't fit. And a lot of racism, et cetera. So I think that really fueled me and I think has allowed me to do this work now. But most importantly, I shared the story as we were talking, is that my dad, when we immigrated to the US, I remember him talking about the resume process. And so him having to change his name on his resume because Jamil Khan was not gonna work and he wasn't getting interviews despite his really incredible background. And so he changed it to James. And he changed the last name and then started getting interviews. And so I think that's just kind of been stuck in my brain. So that's the 2-second tried version of my background.
Well, thank you for coming today. It's an honor to speak with you. My name's Ann Anaya. I'm the Chief Diversity Officer at 3M. And I just want to start with the question posed, which is, what is this diversity and inclusion initiative or importance in our corporate worlds? And I want to start with the idea of, you have to ask yourself as a company who you want to be internally. What is the experience of those that work for that company? What is the culture? And then you have to ask yourself, what is it that people see, customers and clients, and what do they interpret the culture to be when they think of your company? And I would pose to you that it should always include a high commitment to diversity and inclusion when people think of your company, your products, or working at that company. And we'll get into why, the why and the how, but I just wanted to throw that out there as to the importance of diversity and inclusion and the relevance within corporate sector. So I am a recovering lawyer, 20 years as a trial lawyer for state and federal government. Most recently, I was a federal prosecutor here in Minnesota for 11 years. And I moved to, after 20 years of being a trial lawyer, I moved into the corporate sector for a new challenge and started in compliance and then moved to litigation, and then a year ago had the opportunity to take on the chief diversity role. So the first time working outside of the practice of law in the last year. And my story is, I was born and raised here in Minnesota. I'm the first professional in my family. My dad, like Sophia's dad, his name is Miguel Anaya, but always went by Mike Anaya, because, as in his words, it was easier for people to say and remember. But truly, it was easier for him to be Mike Anaya as opposed to Miguel Anaya. So growing up in a Mexican-American family here in Minnesota, you develop, I think, an interest in fairness and equality, at least I did. And that is the reason why I went to law school, is in pursuit of equality and justice. I thought the practice of law would help me find ways to add value in that pursuit. And I was fulfilled by it for many years, but always a part of my practice of law, there was a dedicated volunteerism toward diversity and inclusion, whether it was on hiring committees or community organizations, bar associations, and the like. When I got to 3M, I started in the Diversity and Inclusion Committee within Legal Affairs and had some success in measuring inclusion in legal affairs. And that's how I was asked to take on this role as Chief Diversity Officer. So to the point that was made about the journey from awareness and unconscious bias toward a call to action, I would say this, that for many years, perhaps even decades, we've been talking about unconscious bias, and at some point we have to admit to ourselves that it's no longer unconscious. At some point we have to say to ourselves, indeed, we have to take action to level the playing field. Whether it's for gender, ethnicity, race, disability, or other, the playing field has to be leveled. And therein lies our missions and our goal, is how to level that playing field, and at the same time, how that will benefit our corporations, help them grow, help them lead, help them innovate and be creative, but most of all, back to this word culture, help that culture be the best place it can be.
Thank you. So I wasn't going to talk about this at all, but since you both talked about your fathers, I'm going to talk about my great-grandfather-in-law, who was a Russian Jew, and the last name was Ashavsky, and emigrated from Russia to Finland and wanted to have a shorter name that wasn't very Jewish, and changed it to Ash. And then when he got to Ellis Island, he was 6'5", and since he was coming from Finland, he changed his name to Finn, since they called him the Big Finn. So that's how I got my last name.
Interesting.
So, yeah. So we kind of know what diversity and inclusion is, but let's talk about the little specifics of why we do this. We know there's an affirmative action plan where there's government mandates, but that's not the reason that companies do this, or it doesn't really drive their plans. I think it has more to do with building a culture of innovation, making people feel inclusive, and that their thoughts and their ideas are valued and respected. So I'd like to know a little bit about, how both of your companies are going about in inclusion of the employee pool. And we can talk about that from a formal standpoint of programs that you do and an informal. And I know both of you do something very wonderful, and they have employee resource groups. And I'm just going to let you both talk about that if you want to go first.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So any company that does business with the government has a mandate to have affirmative action plans. We all know that those affirmative action plans, although they can be audited, they have not made a difference in diversifying the workforce. So the question is, what else? The idea of diversity and inclusion, for me at least, is that first you have to have public goals, then you have to measure progress towards those goals, and then you have to have accountability for progress. So we have a sustainability goal related to our diversity. We call it, the metric we use is the diversity index. And in 2015, we declared a goal to double our diverse pipeline of leadership in 10 years. So we measure progress quarterly towards that goal. The other piece, inclusion, is the broad piece, and I would argue the improvement we've made over the last decade or so from only talking about diversity to talking about diversity and inclusion. And inclusion is measured by a standard opinion survey, 11 specific questions within that survey. That is a metric called the Inclusion Index, and each business and function globally will be measured and held accountable for that Inclusion Index as well. We have also decided that you have to have troops on the ground to implement and enforce and encourage and engage. So each country and each business and function have an inclusion champion as of this year. And the inclusion champions will help drive those two indexes, diversity index and the inclusion index. The other piece that I will say about inclusion is engagement. We have the good fortune of having 9 employee resource networks. Some of them are over 40 years old, and some of them are newer. Those employee resource networks are organic. They are from volunteer leadership positions for people in the different resource networks who really look at a strategy for how to best form a community within 3M, how to develop, and it also is a really good tool for retention in that the employee resource networks act as a network for opportunities within 3M, for stretch opportunities, development, and promotions. So quickly, that was my response to the how.
And so I'd just say that, a lot of what we do at Medtronic isn't that different than 3M. I think you'll find a lot of companies of our size and scale, we're all global, that, certainly there are requirements by the government, particularly in the US, but also in all the countries we operate in. So, being in global roles, we have to look at not only the regional law, but the local law. And, there are some challenges there. So a lot of what, Ann shared, we also have, we have aspirational goals that we established. So if we want to talk about just metrics for a minute, which are really near and dear to my heart, because of otherwise it's very difficult to get credibility in this space without actually measuring what you're doing. And so here's what I'll say. Look, talking about inclusion is critical, but representation matters. And to be really frank and open about that, it matters for many reasons. And I would say because we do still have underrepresented populations, whether it's in the US or across the world. We can talk about the most obvious, gender. Okay, so we have an aspirational goal at Medtronic to have 40% or more manager and above global representation for women. And we're very close to it, but it's not about just being close to it. So I want to be clear, it's about everything that fuels the engine to build talent. From a U.S. ethnic diversity standpoint, we have a goal, aspirational goal, around 20% or more ethnic diverse talent in manager and above roles. Now, all the benchmarks and aspirations that we have are all based on availability of talent. So I do want to just kind of emphasize that representation does matter. It is important. But beyond that, those obvious areas, there's many areas of opportunity, whether it's veterans, LGBTQA, disability. There's so many unspoken realities of diversity that I know at Medtronic we've taken a really, I would say, kind of heavy hand to be more explicit about, that as much as the gender and ethnic diversity are critical and we have opportunities, when we look around the world, generational diversity is important. You just name it. The dimensions of diversity are vast. They're also part of the discussion when we talk about inclusion is diversity of thought. Now, I'll say it sounds really nice, right? Like, oh, diversity of thought. A lot of people like to talk about that because guess what? Then they don't have to talk about representation. So when we talk about inclusion, it is, at Medtronic, we really look at experience. Not everybody's going to have industry experience coming in or specific med device. Our business model at Medtronic is changing. Like a lot of businesses, products, services, what are we offering, where's the value in what we provide? And so therefore, we need more diversity of thought in the room. And our CEO, Omar Ishraq, talks openly at every town hall around, well, what does that mean, diversity of thought? It means, and a lot of the work on unconscious or conscious bias, and we have the same belief system in the sense of, if you've got a brain, you got a bias. And so, whether it's fight or flight or however you address something, we all have bias, right? You've probably come into this expecting to hear something or you've got an opinion on something, and we may or may not challenge that bias that you have. And I'm not necessarily here to do that, but we're here to get you to think bigger. So I just wanted to kind of talk about that first from kind of the way we look at inclusion and diversity. But secondly, when you think about formal structures, we have goals and objectives for our vice president and above population, and it's not just about representation. So a lot like what Ann had shared, we also have an engagement survey. And so it is looking at what is world-class, where should we be, where do we have opportunities. We also have about, I think it's 11 or 12 questions now, focused on culture. So at the root of everything at Medtronic, it's our heritage. We have tenets for the company, specifically one of them focused on the personal worth of all. Now this was penned, when the company began. It had nothing, they weren't thinking about inclusion and diversity, but when they started, they were a small company, okay? Now we're 86,000 plus strong. So now when you take and adapt personal worth of all, well, what does that mean? And so the structures we have are like employee resource groups that you shared. What we have is about 15 employee resource groups, very grassroots. So what we have is the heritage of the company. We've got these grassroots that are self-started. We've got groups that are focused on some of, the devices that we make. We've got employees who have family members of themselves who use our product. And so how do they come together to talk about what we're doing, how we're being innovative, how is the product being used? Then we also have the traditional kind of ethnic diversity and gender, LGBTQA, et cetera. But what's different with us is we actually have networks that are VP-driven. We do quarterly diversity reviews with our CEO, and we spend a full day really looking at more the strategic arm. We look at the grassroots arm, we look at the heritage, and then we look at the data and the metrics. So that's kind of a bit more of a holistic system that we use. But like I said, I'm going to stop there because there's a lot to talk about.
So, other than employee resource groups, I know another way is to educate your employees on what inclusion looks like within the company. Can you talk about some training programs, or whether they're digital or whether they're CEO town hall meetings that communicate? What do you do other than employee resource groups to train the employee population on this subject?
Sure. If you don't mind, I'll just continue because my
sure.
brain. So certainly town halls. So, our CEO, you talk about top down. It's very easy for any leader to say, oh, I believe in inclusion and diversity, but go the opposite direction. I've been in lots of different industries, and I've seen a lot of discussion on this topic. With our CEO, it's fascinating. He spends every town hall not just we talk about engagement, we talk about representation, but he really, it's almost like he's processing live on stage, so Omar Ishraq, and he'll say, you know what, diversity of thought, but let me tell you why it's important. It's not just important to just have people who are different in the room, but what do you do with that? What happens when you leave the room? How does that challenge our thinking and impact our patients? At the end of the day, we're here to save lives. So how do we improve that process, right? And how do we make sure that we've got a lot, and people pushing, right? People pushing that healthy tension is really, really important in I would say both of our businesses, and that's allowed us to be innovative. Like I said, we've got goals and objectives, but we also have a lot of leaders who, there's a lot of mechanisms in town halls. We do online training. We also have embedded it in all of our manager trainings. So where there's unconscious bias, it's kind of like, how does a manager be a good manager? I would say our bias is, right, how do they make decisions? And it's not just managers, but our focus is everybody makes decisions every day. Either you know it or you don't know it, right? It's more overt and not. And everybody has a role in that. So how do we make sure we're making better decisions? And how do we mitigate the bias that we have? And so we've been doing a lot of work in this space with managers, with leaders, at town halls, our top officers of the company. We come together actually this week. And I'll be spending some time with them doing kind of like a State of the Union, if you will, but also really challenging them on strategy. So a lot of the inclusion and diversity work is no longer just an overlay. It's a very, embedded part of our system. Everything from talent management, how we select everything, to strategic design for the company. We meet with our board of directors. So it's all the way top down, kind of grassroots up.
I would just offer from the opposite direction. We have found that the tone at the top is essential, kind of table stakes. But what we have found through the inclusion survey is there are individuals that are looking for small, safe places to have difficult conversations. So each quarter we have what we call an I'm in discussion, where we choose a topic du jour, and we usually have an external speaker tee off the topic, and then we have table conversations within those groups with rules. And the rules are that, number one, the conversation at the table is respectful, it's safe, and it's confidential. And then finally, everybody gets their turn to share their voice. So we found that to be a really good piece of just having a dialogue about what diversity and inclusion is and should be.
Thank you. In terms of, I don't want to get too much into the recruiting of a diverse workforce, but to have a short conversation on that, how are both organizations deliberate in their outreach to drive a diverse talent pool? And also, what are the policies that the companies have to drive those behaviors, i.e. like a partner healthcare benefit? So it's kind of a two-pronged question.
That's a lot. There's a lot in that
Okay.
question.
All right.
So
How about you
why don't we
deliberate?
start with
All right,
recruiting?
right.
Because
Okay, that's fine. That's great.
there's
Yep.
policy and then there's reality, right? So I mean, certainly we have policies in place, so we can start there for a second. I think, we've recently, and I know 3M too, have recently kind of, I would say, done a leapfrog on our family leave, so that we're really being more inclusive of what is family, and being more inclusive and deliberate. So we listen to our employees. I would say our networks that I mentioned, we've got 4 core diverse networks and growing that we interact with our CEO. And that forum allows us to ask tough questions, saying, you know what, this benefit is not actually benefiting everybody. If you look at domestic partnership, how do you define marriage, et cetera, and, what can we do? And we look at this globally. So, again, it varies by country, it very much shifts, but we definitely have that grassroots push, and then a lot of support when it comes to policy, just as one, for example. When we talk about recruiting, I think there's a lot of things companies do that are probably pretty compatible. We go to a lot of the diversity events, whether it's National Black MBA, Black Engineers, if it's, Hispanic corporate responsibility. I mean, there's a number of those. But I think what is starting to shift, and in fact, I had a really long conversation with our talent acquisition leader this morning. Lovely human being, we get along really, really well, but pushing hard. Because I said, you know what, we're going and doing, we spend a lot of money, but is it really getting the results we want? And what is the result? Because obviously it's hires, but I'm just not here to count ahead of how many hires we have. It's what is the plan when we show up? How do we show up differently? How do we even position the company so people know who we are? So to me, I would say I'm noticing for us, just a little bit of a shift in what is the approach. And just because we've been going to the same 20 universities, for the history of time, doesn't make it right. And so I think the dialogue has shifted, the openness to talk about recruitment differently, that it's not, here's your scorecard and we need 1 more of these and 2 more of these, et cetera. It's balancing both. So that's just a kind of the quick answer to that. Yeah.
No, I agree. I think diversity and inclusion initiatives are evolving in that I think there was a lot of window dressing, a lot of talking, a lot of, like I said, building awareness, but not a lot of actual strategy and plan that were measured with results. And so I think there is that shift. I also think back to this word culture, when you ask who you are as a company, or what it means to be an employee of that company, I think it's important for you to work with brand and design to explore that and embed the importance of diversity and inclusion in the question of who you are through branding and design. So we developed a campaign for diversity and inclusion called Different Minds Inspire. Each quarter we have actions related to that campaign. And then moving into next year, we'll continue that campaign and evolve it, moving from what we're calling this year a year of empathy, and next year a year of action on collaborative, integrated teams. So, diversity and inclusion has to be not just embedded in policies and part of a scorecard for accountability, excuse me. It also has to be part of a strategy in design and brand, because if you're not communicating that internally and externally, then it's never going to come to pass.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing to that, because
Yeah.
I think, Anne, the one word that you talked about, and I know we talk a lot about, is culture. And it's, when we look at Medtronic, and any company I've been at, look, I've been at the PepsiCo's, I was at 3M, I've been in lots of different industries and financial, and at the end of the day, it's what's at the core of the culture. Because whatever's at that core, what founded that company to begin with is, you hope it stays. I hope it's for the right reasons, right? But you hope it stays. But everything that happens around that core is thinking about not just today, and we talked about this before we were on this panel together, and just chatting about what we do, and it's what's coming. What do we anticipate? Again, things are changing rapidly. People's mindset, people's short attention span. how they're picking companies. So when you think about culture, it's kind of what's at the core, how do you share that externally and internally so you're proud of it, but then also, how do you message, well, what does it mean to us? And what might it mean to you? So whether you're at the company, I want people in the company to know that we're speaking the truth, that what we talk about externally is what we live internally, and vice versa. So I think, like you said, I think throughout my journey in HR, 25 years or whatever it is now, it's that piece around what's the say-do ratio? And I think what I'm seeing shift is people really paying attention to personal accountability in this space. Again, data, metrics, representation, that matters. But what matters is then what culture that you're working in and operating in, and that it's staying true.
So can we talk a little bit about how diversity meets the needs of communities and how socioeconomics and the changes in that over the years have affected diversity inclusion?
So one of the things I think that's really important when you're talking about diversity and inclusion strategy is to link it to feeling valued, feeling that he or she belongs, and that there's a sense of purpose around it. So at 3M, we have a foundation, 3M Gives, that does outreach into the community. And what we're trying to do is strengthen the relationship of the employee resource networks and our outreach into the community so that the engagement not only includes personal development, but that there's also a tie to how 3M presents in the community and its giving, and what opportunities we're providing internally to our employees to help them grow, whether it's grow in the sense of how they volunteer or grow in the sense of how they become better people.
Yeah, I think we have the similar, again, it's a similar platform and I think a lot of companies do. I think, there's foundations, philanthropic efforts, and I think that's massive part of both of our cultures, and I think many cultures I've been part of in my career. And so connecting that to the employee resource group so that they're sharing what they feel is important in the community. I think getting kind of that, stakeholder, that internal perspective on what really matters to their community or where they work, et cetera. So I know we've done a lot of work in our communities, like Puerto Rico, for example. We really mobilized. I remember being at a meeting actually with a Hispanic Latino network. There were 300 of us in a room, and suddenly what's happening, and we immediately stopped the meeting and mobilized, wait a minute, we need Spanish speakers, wait a minute, who's in what functions, what are we gonna do, and many of us getting out there to do some volunteer work, certainly through our foundation and philanthropic efforts, but it's just to watch it in action. I think, again, both at 3M or, you pick your company, a lot of companies kind of stop and drop and go, and I think that's a real testament to the culture. But I also think, when we look at it, the inclusion and diversity space externally, we have to look at our patients. We have to look at the demographics of our patients and the access to what we provide. And so the accessibility is a really big component. There are certainly countries when we think about some of our products where there might be, I don't know, I'm looking at Jeff from Medtronic, there might be, you can give an example too, Jeff, but there might be a product that we need. And there might be one of those that is servicing 500 people, where in the US it's just in the clinics. So depending on what product we're talking about, it's what's the accessibility, how do we work with the physicians? So partnerships are really important for us. The physician partnerships we have, educating them, building partnerships with them. Our employee resource groups and our networks have done a lot of work to help us I would say fill the gap of what are we missing when we have this conversation. So that's been a big part of, again, that ecosystem and how we approach this. It's been really, really powerful for us.
Again, there's the generational answer. So different generations of employees have different expectations of what their personal and professional growth should look like. So what a baby boomer wants in their career is different than what a millennial or a Gen X wants. And is there something that both companies do to talk about with those different generations of employees what's important to them for like millennials, they want to feel that they're being developed. And, you know, baby boomers have been there. So how do you look at generational differences as part of the inclusion process?
Sure. Well, I think it really is about differences, different experiences, different expectations, different perspectives. So I don't think that the approach to generations is any different than the approach you would have to other dimensions of diversity. You know, one of the things that I think is true throughout all those dimensions and the interactions within those interactions is that what has to happen is communication. And then once there is communication, there has to be some exchange about what's reasonable and what's probable, what is possible. And if people feel engaged enough to share their opinions and they see a responsiveness in you, then I think you're in the best place you could possibly be to have a full engagement with whatever dimension of diversity, but also to be more informed and responsive to how you can build a better culture. So the communication is a two-way street and mutually beneficial.
I mean, I would say, you know, there's no kind of formal mechanism. I mean, like you said, you know, we treat generations just like any other topic in terms of, look, it's diverse. And by the way, it's different. So, you know, you've got the US focus on generations, but depending on if you're in Japan or if I'm traveling through Latin America, it's going to be very different because you have to look at the demographics. So the breakdown of generations is totally different. And what's needed is really different. And so in doing this work and spending time and, you know, kind of traveling extensively and kind of uncovering my own biases that, you know, I thought I knew something because I lived in Japan growing up, but it's different living there as a child than it is going to work. And so it's what matters, again, getting to the root of what really matters, and also paying attention to what's happening in the community, in the society, because you know, we have kind of the corporate or enterprise view of a lot of the work we do, but once you kind of feet on the street, and being really intentional about spending time in those countries, it's a lot of fly in, fly out, and so, and working with many of our leaders, you know, I've challenged them forever to say, and they're doing it, is kind of going, when you go, who are you spending your time with? So whether it's generations or otherwise, I need you to spend an extra hour here. I need you, and I find the opportunities to get them to engage. It's not because they don't want to, it's because they're flying nonstop and can barely even see their own families, right? So it's getting them inserted, getting myself inserted in the work. Just because I do the work doesn't mean I know everything. You know, there's a lot to learn all the time. So it's getting inserted and figuring out what matters and having conversations. And you know what's fascinating, take a little bit of different approach here, is I think it's kind of the notion of know thyself. And so when we talk about culture, we think about kind of the ecosystem. I think about my education, my background, what drives me to do what I do. I use that kind of with folks, especially as I do a lot of mentoring or traveling, and people say, what can I do differently? I want to get promoted. I said, first and foremost, forget about the company for a minute. Do you know yourself? Like, do you know what motivates you? Do you know what your interests are? Do you have a vision for yourself? And it's not going to be straightforward. Like, what has changed is it's not going to go vertical. It's not even horizontal. In fact, it zigzags. So the conversation is different and going, what risks are you willing to take? Because if that's not what you want, and knowing we're a very matrix, very kind of gnarly global company, is I like to talk to them about where they are and help that talent, especially millennials, if you just want to talk about them for a minute, is helping them understand kind of the system. And it's like, don't fight the system, challenge us on things, please do, but don't do it to a point where it's actually working against you. Meaning learn the system, because everything has a system and a process, and help us advance and enhance that, and hopefully we can keep you along on the journey. And so I had to learn that, because I always joke, like in my own career, I've moved multiple companies, I've moved multiple countries, and I did it because I got restless, and so I understand it. But it's also natural curiosity, so it's a bit about how you kind of uncover what the talent is asking for.
Great, thank you.
I was just going to add to that, I think the optimal approach is to find topics that are relevant to all dimensions, whether you're diverse or not. Yeah. So, for example, we took the work the respectful workplace training and revamped it and called it respectful and dignified workplace. And that's relevant to everybody, but it also is relevant specifically to those that maybe feel disrespect at times because they are diverse. So finding topics that are less about diversity and more about inclusion and relevant to mutually beneficial topics is, I think, the key.
Thank you. You mentioned Japan, which made me think of the differences between U.S. headquartered organizations versus non-U.S. headquartered organizations that have also a U.S. presence and headquarters here versus companies that are mostly not in the U.S. So kind of three, but if we focus on, what I'd really like to focus on is the difference between companies that have a U.S. headquarters or companies that also have a U.S. headquarters. And I have found in my career working with my clients that the companies that do not have a U.S. headquarters to begin with, and U.S. is just the next step for them, have less of a diversity inclusion need than the U.S.-based companies. They don't seem to have the mandate that U.S. companies have. And where do you see that? And I know you both have companies that are extremely global, so I know that's another big topic, but.
So I think diversity is defined so differently in each country, specifically the U.S. So yes, U.S. companies, U.S.-based companies have a whole history of diversity and inclusion and have matured on that journey, and it is then infused throughout the globe if it's a global company. But even for companies that are U.S.-based and have subsidiaries around the world, it's been interesting for me to travel around the world and understand how a topic like inclusion is defined in any specific country. It's amazingly different. And you know, the one true constant dimension is gender, but how you tackle issues of gender, for example, in Japan, as opposed to a place like Poland, is very different, or even South Korea. So I think we have to look at this topic, diversity and inclusion, through a lens of what is relevant to that specific culture, which is, again, back to this word culture. And then when you define that, then you can move to strategy.
Yeah, I mean, I was sharing a little bit, we were talking before this panel, and, you know, about this exact conversation, and very similar that, you know, obviously, you know, just traveling and where we work, and, you know, you don't always talk about diversity. I mean, it's just not always the top of mind, and, you know, for me, it's always constantly kind of making sure that we're not just looking at it from a U.S.-centric standpoint, again, that it's not take what we've done here and, you know, for example, ethnic diversity. Okay, so when we look at race and ethnic diversity, or just ethnic diversity and race, it's talked about in two very different ways. And when you go outside of the U.S. and even, I would say outside of the United States, you know, you're looking at topics around country of origin, not ethnic diversity, and you don't talk about ethnic diversity, and in fact, it's against the law. You don't count ethnic diversity or country of origin. I just had a whole conversation with folks who are doing some work in Europe around really challenging, and we actually have been doing it in the Middle East too, but challenging this notion of what is inclusion and diversity, and people saying, some of my friends in the US saying, well, wait a minute, if we're in France, wouldn't we say, hey, what's the representation of this particular team, and maybe we need a North African on the team, maybe we need a Turk on the team, and I said, no, that's not how the dialogue goes in France. It's not the same representation conversation that we have in the US, so as much as we're ahead, there's still some fundamentals that we still have to kind of talk about, but at least we're talking about it. And so kind of that back and forth conversation around what does diversity mean, because especially sitting in the US, everybody automatically jumps to kind of the two that we talk about, the two that we measure. And globally, you can measure gender, and potentially generations, but a lot of the data, I mean, you can't have it. And so we talk about things like LGBT. So when you think about the LGBT, Q community, we operate in countries where the local law is completely against the LGBT community, yet what happens in our four walls and how do we protect our employees? So our four walls might be inclusive, but when they leave work that day, it might not be inclusive. And so we don't want to put that employee in harm's way, but we also want to make sure that they have the freedom to be their true self and their best self at work. So there's a lot of realities, right? The dichotomy of what we operate in on a daily basis.
So we're getting to the end of our hour. It went really fast.
It did.
One maybe last question before we get to some Q&A. In terms of best practices, and I know both companies have aggressive diversity goals, what have you implemented in these processes that has worked the best and what hasn't? And what do you think the future for the company looks like in continuing to act on this inclusion process?
Sure.
Well, there's been a lot of lessons learned. And I think I mentioned it earlier, I think what does work is, and I'll be honest, it's probably my own bias of how I do the work, but I have to look at, again, the culture that I operate in, and Medtronic being, evidence-based, data's everything, evidence is everything, it's the bread and butter of what we do to save a life. And so when I look at how people come into the company, whether they're industry or not, kind of what's their mindset on the, and how would I approach them? So for me, it's coming to where that person is, not where I am. My work is dependent on what they do every day and how this can be an asset to them. So it's looking at the system. So very much a systems approach, really looking at, whether it's talent decisions. So for example, what's worked is our org talent planning, which is our succession planning process, is there was always an inclusion and diversity element to it, but it was getting us beyond who's inclusive and who's diverse. It's really looking at, again, the whole system of development and looking at the whole system of how we select, looking at things like diverse slates, like a lot of companies, we all have, we want to have a diverse slate of candidates, and that's a global piece, is having great talent with industry or, education diversity, but then who's being selected? So challenging those and inserting the discussion, making sure we are having the discussion we need to have. So you've got the system, the approach, and the discussion that has really changed the way we talk about talent. Also from a goal setting, I mentioned strategy, so inclusion, diversity, we are really fortunate to be able to speak with the most senior leaders in our board of directors. So it's not just going to the board and presenting the data, it's having the conversation with them about having them challenge us on what we're doing. So it's kind of a data approach, but then there's also the change management component. Change is hard. Nobody really loves it that much. And a lot of us resist. You pick the topic. It's easy to resist. But it's, again, getting in the mindset of how is change approached at the company, what's worked, what hasn't. And so I've used that approach with inclusion and diversity. What hasn't worked is mandating it. What doesn't work is, yes, we have requirements, so I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth, is we have requirements and goals, but how you approach that goal is really important how you talk about it. So it doesn't feel punitive. It's not an us versus them. And that when we talk about inclusion, everybody's diverse. Everybody has an element of diversity. It may not be what's on the books, right? But challenging that notion of what is diversity also. And that's not always easy because not everybody wants to have that topic. And anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah. So really quickly, best practices, I think, are putting equal weight for both diversity and inclusion, setting a goal and holding people accountable for progress towards that goal through data and metrics. What could we do better? I think we could do better with transparency. And I also think we could do better with convincing those that are not yet convinced about the value of diversity and inclusion. I think many times we preach to the choir, and we have to find ways to reach more people.
Thank you. So in closing, we'd like to have a call to action. As Ann calls this, it's the work of all. So what's your hook? What do you want to learn? And how will you take this information into your own life, into your community, into your work, and help your companies become more inclusive? What will you do? So Thank you. Yeah.
Yes.
I think we skip the mic. I often find that introspection is sort of it's an exercise, and first you have to do the defensive, introspective action where you're kind of defending yourself to yourself, and then at least I do, and then I have to be like, okay, well maybe you should be a little more honest with yourself. You probably didn't act the right way, and then you do that. But I mean, you have to have like a safe space to be introspective, and we're asking companies in some respects to be introspective as a whole. What is the safest way for a company to audit whether or not they're actually talking the talk on having an inclusive workforce? And is there a point at which, 5 employees, 10 employees, 2,000 employees, where you can actually start this and actually have it be a meaningful exercise?
So, well, I think, and I mentioned earlier, right, know thyself. That's kind of my own mantra, actually, because you can fight with yourself all day, right, about what you should and shouldn't be doing. But I think part of the dialogue has been, because you're right, we're asking people to dig deep. We're asking them to say, hey, we all have a bias, but we don't want it to be punitive. I think it's a lot of what, and I can just say what I've personally done is with a lot of our leaders is I just, I'm very open with them anyway. I'm pretty direct with them, and I'm expected to be, but have a lot of conversation. We've also done things on the flip side through our employee resource groups, through different focus groups, is we have the organizational health survey, so we're very transparent with what is, you talk about and transparency, we're very upfront about what is working and what's not. Where we've got opportunities, so we do that as well. But in between, we have a lot of crucial conversations. So during times where in our own backyard in Minnesota, there was a Philando Castile shooting, right? And so our African American and African descent community came to me and said, there's so many things going on in our community, and sometimes when we come to work, I don't know how I feel. And I don't know how I'm supposed to feel, and I don't want to talk about it, and everybody wants to talk to me about it. So that's just a really real-life example, and that led to some pretty open dialogue. We actually had dinner with our CEO and many other leaders, and some of those that are leading our employee resource groups to talk about what is going on. Put everything else aside and say what's happening, in our backyard, what's happening across the world, et cetera. So we've done some, I would say, mini dialogues, and set them up in a way that people understand. And our CEO, I just have to say, he's an individual who is really non-assuming, and so, him wanting to understand what is going on, what does it mean when you say it impacts you, what can we do in the workplace? So that's just one example. We've had lots of what I'd say kind of crucial conversations on some hot, relevant topics. We've talked about things, I know I'm not gonna go deep on it, and I'm looking at my PR friend, but immigration. We had a whole conversation before we got up here around, and this happens all the time, immigration. We have employees who were traveling to countries that were on the, banned list, who are our employees who didn't feel safe. Can they come home? What's going on? So there's never a day in this work where there isn't something that we need to talk about. And I know we've been really fortunate at Medtronic to have some open conversation. And we've had it from our CEO, we've had it from various leaders. I've challenged some of our leaders who have said things that, they didn't intend, again, as that unconscious perhaps, things that come up, and I say, okay, hold on, let's talk about this. So it's just, those are just some examples, but we have a long way to go. Absolutely, 100%. So we've addressed it in multiple ways. One of the things, so we had, actually during that time, one of our largest employee resource groups. Like you said, we've got many that go 40 plus years back. This is Aspire, which is our female sales organization, who come together once a year, and there's a little over 1,000 folks. And so our CEO, everybody wants Omar to take the stage. Well, that's great, right? And we can provide him a script, but he'll say whatever he wants, and I think that's great, and people see that. And he addressed it specifically and said, look, you know what? No. Zero tolerance for this. We're not going to put, and he also sent the message to our executive committee, et cetera. And I was in a meeting with him. So I've seen him in different ways from his voice and even at his town hall. And actually it'll probably come up in next week's town hall is, him being very clear about the company and his personal convictions on this topic. So, I mean, I have to say, in all my career, there are times when I'm like, Omar, please hold on a minute, you know, but at the same time, I appreciate it. You know, because he does it in a way that is just, and he's a processor, so he's processing on stage at times and then has some realities about things. So absolutely, whether it's Me Too, I mean, you name the topic, honestly, you name the topic, we discuss it. We have to. It doesn't mean it's always in a public forum, okay? We are challenged with what we take a stand on and what we don't take a stand on, because we are a global company. But, you know, we've had many, many local and global instances where we've had to speak up.
So two things. I'd like to go back to your original question about size. So in my experience, size is not, should not at all be an issue. Some of the most diverse law firms that 3M works with are the smallest ones, the minority-owned law firms. And I would just challenge you to think of the idea of a culture fit, throw it out, and think of the idea of a culture add. Will this person add something new and unique to this company, to this team? And if the answer is yes, that should be a high positive for whether or not the person would join. And then I would like to just go back to your question about Me Too. Again, under the theory, how can you approach this in an action-oriented training, and how can it be applicable to everyone? So what we did is active bystander training. So you see something, whether it's sexual harassment or disrespectful conduct of any sort, we tried to give people tools on how to respond to that, and to be an active bystander in a place where they feel comfortable, whether it's immediately or sometime near thereafter, that these were the tools that one could use so that, again, we're all owners of this culture of inclusion, and let's not stand by and watch something, you know, disrespectful happen.
You know, when people feel appreciated, they not only rise to their full potential, but they become very good employee. They add so much more value to their employee when they become appreciated, and that's really what inclusion is all about.
Yes.
So, yeah.
I have a question, and just said that creatively with the culture add. So what other ways are you breaking down? Because that's one way through our psychology, say rather than, you know, being fit, being add, and that just completely flips the mind. Is there anything else that you guys do to, I would say, subconsciously break down the walls?
I would just quickly add one other approach that I think is unique and on the rise as far as being something that's persuasive. It's the neuroscience of inclusion. This idea that we have a biological need, all of us, no matter what we are, to feel included. And when we do feel included, we are much better at all that we do. So if you focus on what we all have in common, which is this biological need to feel included, then we start to have ownership in the actions that create a more inclusive culture.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think I mentioned, you know, both of our companies, you know, we spent time in the neuroscience space of this and kind of how you make decisions. And I'll be honest, I mean, there's just a lot of opportunity. We've been teaching kind of our leaders, if you will. I mean, kind of, you know, there's healthy tension all the time, and how to be like, and we're expecting them. We're saying, if you're going to be a leader at this company and you're in these roles, we expect you to challenge what you're seeing, kind of don't just stand by and accept it and go, ha, 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 you know, that's really funny and uncomfortable, but I'm not going to say anything. And so there's a true, we expect it. It's not just, you know, saying it, but it's, like I said, that say-do ratio. The other piece that we're really focused on is kind of being your best self. What does that mean? I mean, the company can't take it all on, but we're saying, you know, we want you to be your best self. Being your true self, that's hard. That's not easy for anybody, right? So we try to kind of flip the notion that sometimes the company would talk about true self, et cetera, and we were in a discussion just recently. We just started our fiscal year. We were doing our diversity review, and people were saying, no, we got to talk about best self. Because are we really being truthful if we say true self? Because is our company supporting and our culture supporting that? So I would say that to me, I've really noticed the dialogue, I don't know, and completely shift where it's kind of nice to be pulled in now in inclusion and diversity into conversations where we had to kind of push, for a lot of years where there's this pull. Some of it's competitive, but some of it's also, wow, people kind of becoming more aware of their own biases and going and checking themselves. So I'm seeing that shift, but it's a really good question. I know we're getting kicked out.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we're
we're
out
getting
of
kicked.
time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so
We
much.
appreciate
Thank you.
it.